I'm Dan Graboy, and this is Life in Time of Pandemic. The date is July 12th, 2020, and I am speaking with violinist, electronic musician, educator, composer, musician of all trades, Todd Reynolds. Hi, Todd.
Hi, Dan. Hi, everybody.
Most importantly, are you healthy? Is everyone healthy who you love?
Everybody is healthy who I love. We live in a place of very low illness rate. So we're doing fine, and we're all masked up and behaving ourselves up here, opening slowly and being careful.
Good. I want to get later to where you're living and what you're doing there, but for now, can you tell us a little bit about your background? You grew up on the West Coast. I think you
Right?
started as a classical music violinist, very serious about the violin, still are very serious about the violin. Take us through
Yeah.
some of your childhood, if you would.
Oh my. You always go straight for the painful parts, don't you, Dan? Um, my childhood, boy. Well, I guess the both the biggest positive and negative of my childhood was that I was an only child. My father is and was a pianist. My mother had no musical education or real participation in her life except in church. And at the last 4 days of 4 years old, just before I turned five, I was inducted into the Suzuki program, which was being taught at the University of Southern California, USC. I grew up in LA. So my childhood was all about the violin, and I was also from like age 6 to age 13, I was kind of trained to be a network broadcaster, believe it or not, by a woman who became a close family friend. She was the dialogue coach for the kids in the Sound of Music movie. So she was somebody who was all about the English, all about the diction, all about the acting, all about the reading of things. So I was being put up on a little pedestal with a microphone and being asked to read from the Bible a whole lot during my youth, as well as practicing an hour a day. I was up at 4:30 every morning to practice both my speech stuff and my violin stuff. And my first teacher was the assistant to the great Jascha Heifetz. My mom ended up being a secretary for the Heifetz master class, and I later ended up studying with Mr. Heifetz as well.
What was that?
Um,
Let's not skip over that. What was that like?
oh goodness. Well, it's a long time from now in this discussion. Maybe I should just skate through the rest and then bring us up to that place
Okay,
legitimately.
good.
Yeah, like chronologically. So her name was Claire Hodgkins, a wonderful, wonderful woman with 13 cats. And I would go to my lessons and rub my eyes and be kind of miserable the whole time because I was allergic. And but it was a lovely childhood in the sense that I had parents who were all about me doing something that was kind of relevant and taught me discipline and everything else. That's the positive side of it. Negative side was I didn't get out much. I mean, I did get to play with the local kids, but like on a very limited basis. And some of the things I wanted to do, like taekwondo or jujitsu or karate or any of those things, I wasn't allowed to do, or play sports. I never got to. So I was a kind of a sheltered kid in a different way. My father was a church choir director and organist, so I was always playing at church. I was always around at church. He was kind of an ecumenical guy, so we'd go from Methodist to Presbyterian to this. He at the end of his church career, he was playing at temple, playing in synagogue. So anyway, and he was also the organist to the first two big, huge televangelist healing ministries too, both of which were women, Catherine Kuhlman and Amy Semple McPherson. So anyway, this was my upbringing, and by the time I was 13, I started studying with Zubin Mehta's father, Meli Mehta, who also had the American Youth Symphony, which was a gigantic orchestra that he would conduct. It was like every Saturday morning from 9 o'clock to 12 o'clock, 9 a.m. to 12. And then we would do concerts. So I was thrown in there at age 13. He's like, "You must come play in my orchestra." So I would. I went, and all of a sudden I discovered ledger lines that I never knew had existed before. So that trained me really well. That trained me so well. And Mr. Mehta gave me all my rep. He was a Galamian student who came from from Juilliard. He went through actually through Curtis. Mr. Mehta did, and Galamian was kind of the Dorothy DeLay of the time. In fact, I think that maybe DeLay came through Galamian studio. I'm not sure. I don't know that history that well, but in any case, it was a
So,
real
so if I
real
could interrupt,
yeah.
so see, he introduced you to a lot of music that you didn't know existed up until that point, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah, yeah. I mean, the training of a classical violinist is kind of systematic, right? I mean, there's the scale method, and then there's the etudes, and then there's the earliest things that just coming out of Suzuki, you learn some Vivaldi and maybe a Bach double or something, and then when you start into serious study, you go through all the Bach concertos and then all the Mozart concertos, and then you arrive at Beethoven, and then you arrive at Sibelius and all the major things get covered, and then on the way the Beethoven sonatas and all of that stuff too. So there's a real system to it, and there's a level. There's like a leveling up with every piece. So he gave me all of that, and the Galamian training was a training which said, here is my music, you copy with pencil all of my markings, all my bowings, all my fingerings into your music, and that is how you play. It's kind of a very, not to mention that Mele Mehta was Indian, but there's a real guru type of relationship in that Galamian school. It's like, this is how we do it.
It's a little
So
rigid, maybe.
it's rigid to a degree, but nothing, nothing at all like the Russian approach, which I think is much more rigid. Although I really don't know a lot about it. I really just know the Galamian approach because that's what I was trained in. In fact, my dad and mom are stage moms and dads, and my dad calls up Juilliard and asks to speak to Galamian, and he ended up speaking with Galamian's wife, I believe, who is perhaps serving as an assistant, in this role that she played with my dad, saying, "Well, the only people we would recommend on the West Coast are Mele Mehta and Israel Baker, and those are the only two people I would send Todd to." So anyway, I did that until I was 16 or 17. I was starting to kind of, I don't know, lose interest a little bit. My parents wanted to amp it up for me. I wanted to amp it up for me, I think. So
Before we get
yeah.
into the amping, just for any non-musicians who are watching this conversation
Oh, right.
and are wondering about this Galamian system that you were learning, I'm wondering if a professional violinist watching you play would say, "Oh, this person came out of the Galamian system." And is this something visible with the way the bow moves or the fingers of the left hand, or is it more a kind of a way of thinking about music?
That's a real interesting question. I'm glad you hipped me to the idea that some non-musicians also might be watching this. Um, you know, I mean, there are musicians who've told me that I have Heifetzian posture, because I studied with Heifetz. The the Galamian thing, I don't get so much. But yes, there are certain ways, but it's not quite so obvious, right? And also, of course, at this age, I'm so corrupted by so many other things, and I use that in the most loving sense, that word, corruption. And so anyway, I basically studied with Mele Mehta and then ended up with Mr. Heifetz as assistant at the time. And then she ushered me into an audition with Mr. Heifetz. Mr. Heifetz took me on, and I studied with Mr. Heifetz for about, I think, 2 years in that class. It was a very odd time because he was on faculty at USC, had been promised an endowment for teaching there, and then there was some disagreement. I don't really know what happened. We ended up studying on kind of personal scholarship uh, at his house. So I was in that studio that is in all the movies. For those of you who don't know, who might not know Jascha Heifetz was one of those violinists back in the 20th century who was also a television star and a movie star. We did that to some of our greatest musicians, we'd put them in movies as if they belonged there, not really, not an actor, but there to play also. It's like kind of the classical music was kind of shifted into Hollywood mode. And he lived in Hollywood. He lived right above the Capitol Records building in LA. So anyway, there was this studio that Frank Lloyd Wright built for him that was featured in some of these movies, documentaries about Jascha Heifetz. That when Mr. Heifetz died, that studio, and I've got many stories about all of this, but that studio was dismantled and installed in the Colburn School. So one of the teachers has that as his primary teaching studio, and it was kind of put there intact. It was intact. So if I were to walk in there, I'd kind of know where what music would be in the music cabinets. Although I'm sure that's been removed by now.
That's
But
incredible.
yeah,
Was he a stern taskmaster when you watch videos of him playing? He seems like very serious
oh,
and stern, and he was the grand man of the violin at the time.
I'll. Oh yes, and he was Russian trained. He was there. There are some stories I dare not tell, but he was a taskmaster. He expected a lot, and I don't think there was anybody up to the task really. I know I know I know that I was not necessarily the most satisfying student for him. Um, he was, but it was always fraught. I got to say, studying with him was the most wonderful thing, and it was always fraught with fear and apprehension. And would he call you on this? You had to have, when we walked into class, you had to have all your major and minor scales prepared. He could call anything, 3 octave scales in thirds, sixths, octaves, fingered octaves, or tenths. And G flat, of course, was a different fingering than F sharp, and you should know that. And you had to have all your scales. You had to have two movements of Bach. For those of you who might not be familiar with this, as an interesting tidbit, Johann Sebastian Bach wrote 2 sets of music. One for cello; those are the cello suites, and they're all kind of dance suites. You might hear at any given point in time Yo-Yo Ma playing songs of comfort from home, and they will be in there. Yo-Yo Ma's been playing that forever, those suites. Then there's this set of 6 multi-movement pieces called the Sonatas and Partitas by Bach. This is our Bible. And Baroque music up until the time of Bach, really, except for maybe a little bit of Heinrich Bieber, was really always melody with a continuo, which is kind of a bass instrument and a harpsichord filling out the harmony. And of course, Bach was an organist, and so he wrote these pieces for violin where the violin does it all, carries the melody, carries the harmony, carries the bass line. So it's all broken chords. It's all very difficult. It's always very progressive, and it's still progressive for us today. It's like it may be a little easier than it might have been to play back then, but not really. I don't think so. It's the rite of passage for all of us. We have to play all of those pieces.
And
And
the
I just
the sorry, finish up.
I just played the very first one in the cycle 2 days ago in a concert, and I worked on it very hard, and I haven't played in public for forever. And usually when I play in public, I'm playing my music, which is usually heavily improvised. And here I am playing Bach, which is the music I grew up with, and it was still really difficult for me to really bring myself into that mind space and really contribute the level that I really wanted to that performance, just from being weak a little bit and not doing it all the time. Then there are people like Yo-Yo Ma or Peter Wispelwey, cellist, who just play nothing but this. Well, Yo-Yo plays more than that, but Peter Wispelwey, for instance, has only kind of played the Bach suites ever since we were in college with him, Dan, a long time ago. So it's like it's the Bach stuff is formidable. Anyway, Mr. Heifetz,
Well,
scales.
one quick question.
Yeah,
Quick
go ahead.
question to interject. The violin that is played today, that's the same violin basically that he was writing for. I mean, it hasn't changed really unless you put a microphone
It's
on it or something.
changed quite a bit.
It has
Changed
changed.
quite a
Okay.
bit,
And
actually.
and
Yeah.
has that made playing the music any easier or harder or
I had I had a great when I was at Eastman, wonderful lute player and his partner were there. Paul Odette and Crystal. Forget what Crystal's original name was. Crystal Odette too. They were lute. He's Paul Odette's a wonderful lute player, so he would teach there, and he had caused the Eastman School to buy some original instruments, and I got a chance to play those and bows. Bows weren't always this shape, right? They were the opposite shape, much more like a bow and arrow, right? Just with a curve going the other way. And so, and the violins were much less tension. They didn't have metal. I mean, they had metal, but they weren't, making fine metal, which could wind around the catgut. So it was catgut or lamb gut, and
For
on
the
the
strings.
yeah, and then the horsehair has always been horsehair. It's because it has a particular type of a barb on it that pulls against the string and causes it to vibrate. And all that stuff comes from the rabab and the kimanche and like all these ancient instruments, that are related to the violin. Anyway, it's a very different feeling, Dan. And and back then, the original violins were always played in resonant halls in churches, right? So it's like you start the motion and with that bow bent the other way has a natural arc to the sound, and it's looser as well. So breaking chords, even playing three notes at once, is a little bit easier on these instruments. So what happened, that was church music back then. You were playing in resonant spaces. Well, as things became like chamber music, you had to kind of go both ways, and you started to get playing in royalty settings in like small rooms, which aren't really small anyway, so they're probably still reverberant. And then you have the invention of the concert hall. So you've got the architect, the composer, the player, all starting to make these kinds of decisions, which is like require louder instruments. So the violin developed to have more tension and to use steel strings. And so, but even up to Stradivarius and Guarnerius, there's these instruments were still a kind of more loose, playing at a slightly lower pitch. And then it's when you get into the Paganini and moving on past that, you start to get this kind of, and also with the piano, you get this evolution of the instruments to become louder, brighter, so on. So anyway, Mr. Heifetz, Bach was part of it. You had to have your Bach prepared. You had to have a movement from a major concerto prepared to play with the accompanist, and a showpiece. And Mr. Heifetz was great at arranging encore showpieces. So you had to have all this ready to play. And he would just say, okay, Shao Sando, please stand up, do your thing, play this, play your concerto. And then he would have MoCA, and oh my God, if it wasn't ready, he would say, not ready, sit down. And that would be it. It was incredible shame and dishonor to have that happen to you. And it happened to all of us at one time or another. So it was a hard thing, and it taught character. um he was a formidable gentleman, and I think I've said this in public enough that I don't mind saying it again. But the thing that I got from him the most was from watching him when he would demonstrate for us. When he would pick up the violin and demonstrate, he already had had a misplaced shot of cortisone in his shoulder for bursitis, so he couldn't even really lift his arm by himself, right? So he would play with his arm kind of down by his side. But the thing about watching him, and having always watched him because my father was a big fan, and I was at his last recital in 1974, the thing about watching him was he made it look so easy. And there was something, I think, about being with him and being in his presence and kind of watching him work and demonstrate sometimes and be with other people, that I was like, if it's so easy for him, there must be a way that it can be easy. Not thinking, no, I should have worked like, how many more hours a day. But just I kind of imitated that ease, and I always wanted that ease in playing. So that is something I've always kind of pursued, and just tried to, without thinking about it, try to embody. And one thing that Mr. Heifetz always used to say to all of us, this is how stern he was. If you need to practice more than 2 hours a day, maybe you need to find another profession,
Wow.
right?
Interesting.
And meanwhile, you got people at Juilliard practicing 8 hours, 10 hours a day, and getting flawless performances from that. So, I think by the end of practice, by the end of my time with him, I think I was beginning to get that it would be, to be like him would cost me more than I was ready to pay. So I think I stopped wanting to be the next Jascha Heifetz. And that brings us to what happened next, which is that when you let go of wanting to be your idol, when you've broken that idol, when you've smashed that idol, and you're like, okay, I don't want to be that anymore, and you say, what do I want to be? All sorts of things start coming out of the woodwork. And one of the thing that came out of the woodwork first was the idea that, just a pause and an aside, Michael Tenkoff, one of the people who was in our class, who was also a doctor, I remember him asking Mr. Heifetz, what do you think about new music? And I think that during the time, Mr. Heifetz only spoke of Glazunov and Korngold and Miklos Rocha, the film composer, all three of which had written concerti for him, of course. But there was no talk or knowledge or conversation about anything but that particular small slice of the pie. And we're talking about the 70s now, right? So we're already talking about John Cage having happened. We're talking about so much contemporary music development Mr. Heifetz either knew none of or had no interest in exploring. So I began to gain awareness of this. And as I did, that's what grabbed hold of me and shaped the rest of my life as I went to Eastman and fell in with all the troublemakers, the composers, and began to get music written for me and began to try to really be of some service in this idea of moving the art forward rather than concentrating on the recreation of the tradition, like the repetitive, holding up high Beethoven and all of our wonderful classical music tradition and putting that in the concert hall, which for me is the museum. That's like where that takes place most of the time. And like constantly recreating that and kind of holding it up high as the esteemed classical music. I began to identify with this idea of continuing to write the music, have the music written, and have that idea be the forwarding of the tradition. So that's kind of where my career really began, was in service of that ideal.
When did you first plug up to a microphone? When did you first process your sound in any way, or create loops or anything like that? Anything electronic?
I think that happened with Mike Lowenstern. Michael Lowenstern, who, if you don't know him, is a wonderful bass clarinetist. His YouTube channel is Earspasm. His website is earspasm.com. Go see him. Michael and I went to Stony Brook together. Just a real quick one sentence encapsulation of my world from where we were, since you were asking chronologically. Um, I eventually, I did just a short amount of choral conducting in Los Angeles before I left, like for a year or two. And then I went to the Eastman School of Music. Within 3 years, I dropped out and I joined as principal second violinist of the Rochester Philharmonic, where I stayed for 3 years. And then I dropped out and I went back to school for a master's degree without a bachelor's at SUNY at Stony Brook, where Mike Lowenstern also arrived the same year after a Fulbright in Holland. And we both had this interest in anything we could get our hands on new. And Dan Weymouth, wonderful composition professor there, had just been given a budget. He had just arrived as a new professor, been given a budget in the composition department to build a computer studio just like you have, Dan. He had the same mandate, and we were the ones, I think, who were the most interested in it, and we were not composition majors. So he gave us the keys to the kingdom, and we would spend hours in there, hours. And I got a grant to buy some equipment, which was wonderful. This wonderful State University System grant that they gave, an artistic grant. Those were the days, right? And so that was the first time I did. Michael and I would play in the studio all the time. That's when I first discovered that if I wanted to improvise, the best way to do it was to put on a huge reverb and a digital delay and to pluck a note. And that note would come singing back to me, dung, 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 dung. And then I could play another note. And oh my goodness, if I played like kind of a syncopation to it, then I'd have this rhythm that came. And that's my whole world. I'm still doing that to this day. That's my happy place. I'm happier there than playing jazz lines. I'm happier there than playing Bach. I'm happier there than doing pretty much anything. That's kind of where I like to live. And if you visit any of my Facebook lives, that's what you'll hear. That's the first thing you'll hear all the time.
So as many of us did, you moved to New York. I also moved to New York and tried to take that city by the horns. Mm-hmm. And tell
or at
us
least
just
hold on while
hold
writing.
On to it. Yeah. How long did you end up staying in New York? I know I think you still have an apartment in New York, but you're not living there full time anymore.
I don't have an apartment in New York anymore. I gave it up in 2019.
Okay.
So the story goes there that while I was at Stony Brook, probably after I'd finished my master's degree, I didn't know what to do next. I was playing weddings. I was bartending. Michael Lowenstern was scooping skins at a Houlihan's, and we were all just kind of trying to make it a little bit there and stay afloat, not knowing what to do next. And a beloved woman who was a secretary in the music department told me that she had a friend who had a place. It was a $600 one-bedroom sublet in the Jewish garment workers buildings in Lower Manhattan. And so I moved in to Michael Gordon's building right across from the Bialysstoker Synagogue. And I was there from 1990, I'm going to say 1996 to 2019. Is that right? I think that might be right.
We'll put our fact checkers on that afterwards.
Yeah, just Snopes that. So anyway, yeah, so it was a long time that I did New York, and I loved every minute of it. I loved, New York is my soul. That's and you're right. We all cut our teeth there. There was room for everybody. New York is a place where everybody goes who wants to rub up against great folks with the idea that might bring one further in the pursuit of goodness, of learning. I mean, for me, mostly learning, because it's like more than I'd kind of let go of the idea of being a virtuoso in the classical sense. I really had no love for it anymore. I'd moved on from that, and instead I wanted to, give me some Cameroonian music. Is there a Cameroonian band? Is there a jazz band? Is there a rock and roll band that I can hook into? Are there all these different things that I could be part of in the life of New York? And Broadway, Broadway is something that classical musicians usually turn up their nose at. Do you know how many great classical musicians play Broadway? I had my turn in there too. And in fact, I still do play with a wonderful colleague from college, Jason Robert Brown, one of the most incredible writers, composers I know. So I'm still in his band, a Broadway writer, Bridges of Madison County, Parade, Honeymoon in Vegas, all sorts of great shows, Tony Awards too. So, Broadway became something that I really, really loved and still love to this day, although I've only done 2 shows on Broadway during my time there.
Okay.
And Steve Reich are the things that were really, hallmarks of New York for me too, things that I took part in.
But a few years ago, you started making your way out of New York into Western Massachusetts. And now you're living actually about 5 miles from the town that I grew up in.
Right, which is wild, right?
Which is completely crazy. You're in North Adams, Massachusetts.
Yes.
which is not a place one would expect to find a leading electronic musician, maybe. But maybe tell me what led you to establish yourself in North Adams, and what you're doing there.
Um, well, so the thing that led me here is that I've been a part of Bang on a Can, the New York new music collective with Michael Gordon, David Lang, Julia Wolf.
And Michael Gordon, you referred to him just a minute ago that he lived in the same building that you lived
Right,
in
right,
downtown New York. Okay.
right.
Yeah.
Michael and David and Julie. Just a short description of them for anybody who might not know. Michael Gordon and Julie are married. David Lang as well. The three of them went to school together at Yale under the main tutelage of a mind-blowing composer named Martin Bresnik. And Martin said one sentence to them, I think, as a teacher, which really invented Bang on a Can. He said, "You know, you have to create your audience. You got to go to New York and you have to make an audience because nobody's just banging down the door to hear your music because they don't know who you are." And so they went to New York and they started organizing marathon concerts. They would do concerts from like 3 o'clock in the afternoon till midnight. And the secret of Bang on a Can was that these three folks just started creating community. They found all the musicians, whether they were improvising musicians, just like crazy stuff. They were always looking for crazy stuff, whether it be um, severely academic or like minimal, like the Steve Reich and Philip Glass and Terry Riley vibe, or improvisational, like what John Zorn's early vibe was, and continues to be as John keeps expanding. But they would bring all of this together and put on these marathon concerts, and that's what Bang on a Can became known for. Early on, Michael asked me to be in his band, and we would tour Europe together. It was called the Michael Gordon Philharmonic early on, and that's how I got to really know Michael. And but then I became part of the Bang on a Can family, where I still sit to this day. And so we began a school up here in North Adams, Massachusetts, at MoCA, Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, which just reopened yesterday. And in 2001, I believe it was our first. It was our first summer institute here, and we've been doing it ever since.
And just to fill in a little back history, MoCA, the Massachusetts Museum of Contemporary Art, is situated in some of the buildings that constitute the old Sprague electric plant that I believe was manufacturing parts for weaponry in World War II, but had become vacant. It was out of business, and those buildings were
It was,
sitting there idle.
yes, it was a capacitor factory. Originally, it was a textile factory, believe it or not. So, yeah, so this is exactly what you're exactly right. What Mass MoCA is, and now it is the kind of the linchpin to the community. There was some debate when Sprague Electric went out of business, whether it would become a jail, a museum, and I forget what the third option was, but it became a museum, and it's a constantly revolving exhibition space. So anyway, I I had moved up here from 2005 to 2011 as well, after moving on from the band I'd created called Ethel, a string quartet, in 1999. So as I moved up here, I kind of just wanted to be composer in the woods, thinking that this was a good chance to do that. That's where I started my record, Outer Borough, which came out in 2011. So anyway, yeah, that's where we live now, full time. My partner Isabel and myself, and right now, over the past 3 years, we've been doing a lot of residencies where composers or performers, string quartets, come up and we do residencies with them where I coach them. We go out for hikes in the woods. We cook together. So that's been a delight, and when the pandemic hit, of course, the changes implicated in that are so wide-reaching, so far-reaching. We're not going back to a normal, to our past normal. We're going to go toward creating a new normal. So as part of that, I wanted to take our residency thing and put it online. So now Isabel and I have created a program called Amplify This, which is a larger scale school, essentially a virtual academy for those wishing to think outside of the box and increase their virtual online presence and their musical meanderings and also their musical and artistic leadership as we kind of walk into this new way of being together. We're starting a summer program starting on July 19th. It's an 8-week mentoring program.
Oh, that's
So that,
fantastic. Do you have a website that I can put into the
oh,
comments down
absolutely.
here? Okay, so
Absolutely. Absolutely. You can simply go to my normal website, which is toddreynolds.com. I will also put it up here.
yeah, I'll enter all this into the comments for people who are interested in pursuing this.
There we go. And there you can get to the website from there. Yes, please. If you have any people in your life who have been mentioning that they want to move further, faster, expand past what they know, are wondering what's next for them in this time of pandemic and what the world's really going to look like. We're not going back to concert halls right now. And when it gets to be winter and fall, we're especially not going to be going into concert halls at this point. So what music and art means changes cast. It changes color. And also with all of the recent appropriate uh, disturbances and uprisings that are coming up in conversation and in action around oppression, um, we musicians and artists, we need to be there as part of that. And that doesn't mean uh, writing a token piece of music or playing a token piece of music, but being part of an actual movement which which raises all boats. You know, as the tide rises, where we begin to see inequity as something that is an inappropriate thing to accept and live with, I think we can be there and be active in a different way. So that's also part of what the program addresses as well.
Could you paint a picture of two or three musicians who might want to participate in your summer program? Maybe one is a student, maybe one is a young professional. What kind of people would look to participating in your virtual seminar, and what might they look to get out of it?
Sure.
Just fictional characters.
Yeah. Fictional characters. Okay. Well, I'm not going to give them names because that would just, that would be weird. So I would say somebody who has lost a summer program, somebody who was supposed to go to Tanglewood, and Tanglewood ended up not happening. But that person, let's call this person Orlando. So Orlando didn't get to go to Tanglewood, and has been sitting at home and watching his colleagues all do stuff on a cappella, and maybe he has too, but then it's like, he's not quite satisfied with his sound, and he begins to think, oh my goodness, my image is a little blurry, but he's seeing all these other people with different things, and he kind of wonders how to get himself to that point. Meanwhile, after all these years of playing classical music, he sees that everybody's doing a little blue. He has friends. Some people do some bluegrass. Some people do some Irish. Some people play some jazz. And he's like, oh, that's like much too much for me to take on. But man, I would just love to feel a little bit of what that feels like. Well, that's a string player who would be perfect for this program. A 55-year-old orchestra person who sits in the orchestra all day, or for the past 20 years or 30 years, has had an orchestra job, always wanted to do something but never really had the way to do it, never had had the connections to learn some of the things that she wanted to learn. Let's call her Laura. And so Laura has been in the orchestra in one of the leadership positions of the orchestra. She's an oboist, and Laura has been wanting to teach. She's been wanting to teach, and she's also been she's seen a lot of musicians in her community of Ohio who kind of seem aimless, and she wants to corral them together and make a Facebook group where she not only can kind of teach music to these younger kids, but also kind of instill in them this kind of quality of investigation and exploration, which is really a part of her life. And she'd like to amp up her online presence. She's really, really dedicated to the issues of our time and doesn't know how oboe fits with that, but has this sneaking suspicion that there's a way for her, even as an oboist in an orchestra who really has only been used to this one bubble, she has this idea that there might be a way to kind of bust out of that bubble and become bigger and louder and larger and kind of, bring together a larger community. Those are two.
Oh, what
Um,
what I'm loving about this is that number one, it's a very creative approach. Number two, it's, and I don't mean to use this word in its negative connotation at all, but it's an aggressive response to the situation we find ourselves in, to the pandemic, where most people just say, okay, I'm going to wait this out
mhm.
and just hope. And you see this in the newspaper day after day, the assumption that next year will be fine.
Ah,
And but this takes an aggressive approach to the pandemic, saying this is here for now, it could stay, and we're going to do something about it. And we're not just going to roll over and ball up and wait till it passes by, hopefully. So I think that is fantastic, but I also think focusing on creativity rather than finding an empty piece of a jigsaw puzzle and making yourself that shape and plugging yourself into that shape. Instead, saying, I am this shape, what can I do? I really like that. And I wonder, how will you deal with the fact that your students will all be their own individuals? Presumably you have to be very flexible and adaptable to their hopes and dreams.
yeah. I mean, it's interesting to well. First of all, thank you for getting all that out of what I threw at you, because that is exactly the intent. Part of that intent, and in response to what you last said, flexibility and adaptability to other people's situations is indeed kind of part of the puzzle. What I mean to stimulate and support, reinforce, and maybe even create is a sense of resilience and flexibility, which is a human endeavor and a human need in this context. Not a musician's one, not just for actors, not just for musicians, not just, everybody's going through something. I can most easily have a conversation with musicians because this is my family, my whole life. So musicians and I, we hang out. Um, the idea that every person is behind their own screen, behind their own camera, and dealing with their own audio situation, it doesn't matter that they're all different. It doesn't even matter that we've got some real budget differences too, you know. And if there are people who really respond to this program, especially people either in underserved communities or people who have financial challenges, but or need a leg up. And I mean, Lord knows we can talk about the African American community as well in our conversations of systemic and institutionalized racism. I would like to see a program of mine where it was inclusive enough and people could get a leg up as well. So you'll find right there, you'll find a $3,000 price tag for an 8-week program. Please do not pass that number by. and just discount yourself from a program because of money. There's an offer to book a free call with me for a strategy session. Please do it. Um, I really want to, through our school, through our virtual school, I want to be a contribution to the community in building resilience and flexibility. I know myself over the past 5 years, ever since I decided to move up here and start to kind of leave my career behind in New York, the one that I knew, which was one of striving and one of always trying to get the next gig and try to make enough money to live in New York comfortably and all that. When I began to leave that, there were some times when I really needed more resilience than I had. And it was kind of difficult for me to find a way forward. I'm no different than anybody else. Now that I've got enough vitamin D in my body, and I've made some choices in my life which pointed me more powerfully ahead, I'm in a position where I can contribute to others. And boy, contributing to others, teaching others is the greatest education. So this kind of cycling of energy that we do as educators with those who are learning, and the stuff that we get back, it's all a cycle of life that is far more profound than the Lion King. It's something that's really present and tangible. So anybody who's coming to this program brings whatever they got, and we take them wherever they can go, and they design their own course. They design their own program. I'm going to provide a certain amount of baseline technique, like how to build your studio, how to amp up your internet presence, how to think about music outside the box in which you currently think of it, and how to think about being a musician in a larger context than just playing your instrument. These things everybody will get, but there's personal time that I get in terms of mentoring each participant, each fellow in the course, to which we will really design a way forward for them. And we'll talk about a final project which really tells their story and tells their story of where they want to go to and kind of pulls them into the future.
It strikes me that musicians are used to overcoming odds. I mean, we have that kind of in our hip pocket coming through high school, trying to be the best in the school because if there's competition, we're aware of competition right from the start. We're trying to play really well. The instruments are hard. It's hard to play well. You get to college, all of a sudden there's people way better. Again, you're like, wow, I had no idea that could be done. Here we go, work harder, work harder. We have the ethic of having to overcome odds kind of come through our lives. And this seems like it's just building on that. Like, okay, now we're hitting a wall, all of us. Now, here we go again. Let's start planning again. Let's start working towards a new goal. Let's envision a new goal and go towards it. And it sounds like you're saying, I'll help.
I am saying I'll help. That's for sure. And overcoming odds is, you're right. I love to tell the story that for ages, musicians have come in through the kitchen. We have been trying to kind of achieve status and get folks to notice the importance of the arts for a long time. So yeah, this is nothing new to us, and we don't make a whole lot of money. Often we have to do something else besides what we do to make money. So this stuff is kind of these are the odds that we're all kind of used to, that you were mentioning since high school. These are the odds that we're used to. Not only am I saying I'll help, but I've been working this particular side of the game since I set foot at Eastman. I've been thinking always, there must be something more. There's a way to expand here. There's something to learn here. There's this person over here to collaborate with and hang out with. Oh my goodness, dance. What about dance? I love dance. People, certain dance companies, when I watch them move, I cry. How can I participate in that? There are all of these dreams that we have that so often we don't acknowledge because it would just take too much. And I've been through all of that. And a long time ago, somehow I learned, I guess I kind of think it a gift from where I don't know, but a gift, this idea that sometimes choices get made for you. And when I say, I got to be so careful that I really articulate this carefully. I'll tell you a quick story. I was walking back from lunch when I was in the Rochester Philharmonic. I was walking back from lunch and I was considering what my life was going to be like. And I so wanted to do something important. I didn't know what it was, but I knew that there was something I wanted to say or something that I wanted to discover. And if I sat in the orchestra, if I made the orchestra my choice, that I would never have the room to do that, and I'd never be with the people I needed to do that with, and that I needed to make a change. And all of a sudden, it became like a lightning bolt. It was so clear to me. It's like, oh, you're not going to be able to stay here. And then following up on that was another question. Okay, so when do you leave? And I started to think about it, well, maybe at the end of the season, maybe, is it? And something just said to me, nothing said to me. I said to myself, well, no time like the present, right?
You gotta go, you gotta go.
You're not going to negotiate this one. You're 25 years old. You're not going to negotiate this because you just said to yourself something that there's nobody to negotiate with, not your parents, nobody else. You just kind of know this is true for you. I made a left instead of a right. I went upstairs. I went to the CEO and I told him I'd be gone in August. So that's what I mean by saying sometimes decisions are made for you when you can listen to the voice inside of you and say, I'm going to go here now. And whether that means leaving music, whether that leaves doing a different kind of music, whether that means joining a different community, whether that means leaving a bad relationship in like personal terms, whatever that means to you, trauma or pandemic or losing a loved one, I mean, all of these things that happen to us as human beings, they are openings for another chance to make a choice, a new choice, a different choice. Might be a riskier one sometimes, but it can be a real opening to move forward in a more powerful way. So I'm there for anybody who's thinking that way and saying, maybe now, maybe now. There's plenty of infrastructure out there to build new careers. And actually in America, it's been said for many years now, a lot of folks do 3 things in their adult life, not 1.
Well, as I've mentioned in some other of my interviews, the pandemic has given us a gift of time that we didn't have before, because before we were running from thing to thing, we were doing our job, it was busy, there were large demands. And especially for musicians, it's very sad. People who have that big orchestra job, they don't have it now, but they do have time. And time can lead to creativity if you give it the chance. And so I want to thank you for founding your summer workshop, because it sounds like you're really providing a place where people can use time in their favor and not just mark that time and wait for it to end. So I think that's terrific. And I want to thank you so much for talking with me today.
Dan, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk with you and be with you for our long friendship. And I really thank you for asking the questions which allow me to tell you where I'm at anyway.
It's my great pleasure. Thanks.
All right.